Welcome everyone to our Equity in Recovery Housing webinar. We are so glad to have you here with us today. So first we're going to start off, I'm going to just give a little introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Interaction for Health and the work that we do, as well as provide a little context around the recovery housing work that we have been doing and the impetus for some of the work that we're going to hear about today. Interact for Health, our mission is to promote health equity and improve the health of all people in our region. We do that through a number of different roles. So one of our major roles is grant making, and as well as education, both for our grantee partners and the broader community. Research, near and dear to my heart, which you'll hear about some of our research work today. Policy, always important to impacting health. And last but certainly not least, engagement with our community. We always want to hear from you, the everyday experts. We know only a piece. So we, for the last 5 years, have been focused on 3 strategic priority areas in which we have funded and provided support. So the first one is reducing tobacco use. Next, we have increasing access to healthcare through school-based health centers. And last, again, certainly not least, addressing the opioid epidemic, which is obviously why we're here today. Interact for Health serves a 20-county region in Southwest Ohio, Southeast Indiana, and Northern Kentucky. You can see all the 20 counties we serve here on the map. The opioid team is a dream team made up of Sonny Carrico, our senior program officer, Lisa Myers, our program officer who's running the slides today. Thank you, Lisa. And then myself, Michelle Leidenberg, I'm the research and evaluation officer for the opioid team. So to give you a little more context on the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years and kind of how this work all fits together, our overall goal for our work to address the opioid epidemic is to reverse the trend of overdoses and deaths from opioids. And to achieve that aspirational goal, we've identified 4 kind of strategies to reduce deaths and overdoses in our community. So the first being reducing deaths through harm reduction strategies, things like syringe service programs, harm reduction supply dispensing machines, and a lot of other amazing work that's happening throughout our region. Next is connecting people in crisis to care. So our second strategy is around connecting those who need help to the supports they need. So quick response teams are one of the main programs that we funded in this space. They're a homegrown solution to addressing the opioid epidemic, as well as safe places in partnership with the Cincinnati Health Department. And then our third kind of big strategy is to reduce overdose and relapse. And in that bucket, we have work to increase access to treatment. And then, of course, our recovery support work, which includes increasing access to recovery housing services in our region. And kind of underlying all of that, impacts all this work, is our cross-cutting strategy efforts. So that includes data. We've invested in some really great data work in our region to improve the reliability and accessibility of overdose data, along with technology projects and work to reduce the stigma of substance use disorder, which again makes all of these other strategies much more challenging. So to give you a little context for kind of how we got here, I mean, in 2018, we brought together a group of over 100 community leaders focused on addressing the opioid epidemic, and brainstormed what are different topics, what are areas we need to do more work. And one of the places that we landed on through a committee of community members, community leaders in this space was we needed to learn more about recovery housing. Um, even even at the very most basic level, how we define recovery housing varies across the region, person to person. So first, we kind of sat back and decided, hey, we need to do some research and better understand how people access recovery housing in our region. What does that look like? How do they define it? And where are all these houses? My favorite phrase is it was the Wild Wild West. And so we were trying to wrangle the Wild Wild West. So we looked for houses that provided a living environment that are free from substances, focus on peer supports, connection to services and other recovery supports. Obviously, there are guidelines, national guidelines from the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, and it varies across state, but there are state bodies that do certify houses as well. So we looked at all sorts of different houses in this project, and we partnered with a research team from Miami University. Dr. Cameron Hay Rollins and Abby Lockmeyer were our dynamic team that we worked with. And next slide. So for the study, we had two main deliverables. The first was a recovery housing resource guide. Again, just getting a sense of what are the houses in our region, what services do they offer, where are they located, who do they provide services to. So our recovery housing resource guide accomplished that goal. That is available on our website. And then the second piece was a gap analysis. We, again, wanted to better understand what about recovery houses is working and what isn't working. Where are the gaps? What could we help to address in our region? Next slide. So for this study, we did three main pieces that help to give us a picture of recovery housing in our region. So first, after extensive, exhaustive research, the research team reached out to all the recovery houses in our region and had them complete a survey. Second, they conducted an epidemiological analysis based on available data. And then last, they conducted a large number of focus group, 40 plus in our region, representing all 20 counties, close to 200 people, again, to understand the landscape in our region. Next slide. This led to that recovery housing research guide, which created a list of all the known houses in our region. Oh, next slide. And so from there, so kind of twofold, we did release an RFP for recovery housing last year based on the findings of that report, and we will be releasing we have released an RFP this year as well. It was released about a week ago. And we will be hosting an RFP webinar if you're learning more about, if you would like to learn more about the funding that is available and how to apply and what we're looking for. And as part of that, we identified a big gap in our initial study, and that was that we used snowball sampling for our methodology, and there was a large gap in representation from our Black and Latinx community. So we decided to do a part two and be really intentional about reaching out to the Black and Latinx community and get their feedback on the gaps in recovery housing in our region. So, and that's what you're going to hear a little bit more about next. And so next slide. So I'm going to introduce today's speakers. We have Dr. Jennifer Williams with us. She's from Scale Strategic Solutions, which is an evaluation firm here in Cincinnati. And her professional background includes consulting in research and development for the Tri-State Trauma Network, as well as the executive director for the UC Surgeons Inc. out of the Crossfire program. Dr. Williams started her career at P&G in consumer research, supervising and conducting all phases of data collection, analysis, and reporting related to product usage, consumer behavior, and advertising. Dr. Williams has also led a myriad of initiatives and organizations to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and promote social justice. From her work experience, Dr. Williams has gained expertise in pre-K to postgraduate education, behavioral counseling, and social research. Dr. Lawrence Bryant is also with us today. He brings a plethora of experiences and knowledge dealing with substance use disorder, HIV/AIDS education, cultural responsiveness, and issues related to race and sexual orientation. Dr. Bryant has successfully developed and implemented a statewide strategic plan for Georgia in response to the opioid and prescription drug overdose epidemic. Dr. Bryant is also an advanced implementation specialist with the Opioid Response Network, providing training and technical assistance in the areas of SUD, HIV/AIDS, and diversity, equity, inclusion. So we're very lucky to have both Dr. Williams and Dr. Bryant with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Williams to give us some more insights.
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Jennifer Williams, and before I proceed with this presentation, I need to make a general disclaimer. It's been said that the only thing constant is change, and that is certainly true when we consider the recovery environment. Substance use, substance abuse, people with substance use disorders are just some of the labels we used. Addicts, people who are users, people on and on and on. It changes, and I want to say that I may not be using the most up-to-date, politically correct terminology, but I'd like for you to charge it not to my lack of sensitivity, because I recognize it is extremely important for people to be represented in a way that they desire, but fits for them. Charge it to my lack of direct interaction for a few years, and not to my heart or my intentions. It's a process and not an event for me. But hopefully this will also help all of us in the listening audience to be a little more sensitive to representation and language. Language matters, words matter, and I believe we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. So next slide, please. We had a little bit of an overview of what this research is about. I served as principal investigator for the recovery housing gap analysis that Interact for Health sponsored. And we wanted to gather ideas from people who are either people who are using or have used substances or consider themselves addicts or substance users, people who work with service providers for people with recovery treatment and issues, as well as their circle of support, friends, family, people who help them to stay clean and stay straight. And again, recognizing that these might not be the most current terminologies, hopefully I am communicating what I mean to say. They wanted to know about how we improve the existing recovery housing, and as I mentioned, what are the gaps, not only in terms of physical edifices, but within those facilities, what are the needs for recovery and what resources are there and what's needed. We wanted to find out specifically what cultural and linguistic needs for recovery exist, and all of that from the perspective of what we call BIPOC, which kind of makes my hair in the back of my neck stand up, but that is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So if you hear that used, that's who I'm referring to. This study, we were able to have 38 Black or African American individuals for white people and 13 who did not disclose their race. We were limited in terms of trying to have representation from Latinx and Asian American or Pacific Islander Americans. They simply were not readily available or evident in the regions, geographic regions that we tried to access. We had one group of strictly service providers in the focus group because we were very conscious that we wanted to have the people who we call peers or people with lived experience and their families and friends be able to share freely without any concern about retribution or a loss of ongoing support or benefits, etc. And I think that worked out well. Overall, everyone was very interested and happy to be included and ask these questions. Next slide. So today we're going to be giving you just an appetizer. We uncovered lots of rich data, and we are still doing the analysis and putting together a more complete picture. So you'll get what came top of mind or rose to the top evidently in terms of what are some access issues and ideas, what wraparound supports might be needed, cultural needs or connections that may be needed or may need to be enhanced, and then what are some of the desired characteristics? What does good recovery housing look like? Next slide, please. So we'll start with access. How do you get through the door? How do you find the door? Next slide. One of the things that came up loud and clear was that it costs too much money to take advantage or be a part of recovery housing. Most of the people we spoke with simply didn't have that kind of money. Many didn't have insurance or a job that would help pay for that recovery housing, and they were expected to pay their rent like right away, often after just coming out of detox. And there's a lot of other more pressing needs at that early stage of recovery than having to worry about where am I going to stay. So that creates stress for people, some kinds of concerns that often might lead a person back out to solving problems and reducing stress the way they always have by using substances. We don't want that. People found it hard to get that initial rent to pay, and they were interested in having Interact for Health understand that the financial pressures or considerations, they recognize that's a part of being responsible, but they want that to come at a later stage in recovery when they can handle that and they've got a better foundation established. One individual stated very plainly, they want my whole check. Let's move on, please. Next slide. Another access concern that was raised is awareness and education. People weren't really aware of where there were choices for recovery housing. Where do they exist? There's one or two in the hood that most people knew about, but other places they didn't know where they were, and there was some concern about the recovery houses being right in the middle of the hood or where they used to use and where influences that are not so conducive to recovery still exist, and wanted to have a way to be outside of that environment for a while. And so that was kind of a contested topic that we talked about. But they wanted some intentionality that regardless of where these houses exist, they want there to be some equity. People refer to inner city or urban recovery housing as flop houses, just somewhere to hang out. And in suburban or rural areas, they had a lot more resources and amenities and were just overall more pleasant and life enhancing. So that was definitely a gap. And they wanted some education about how do I find recovery housing? How do I know what I'm getting into? Is it a good place? What kind of rating does it have? And even the service providers weren't real clear on what levels of service there were, or how to find recovery housing that fit individual needs and pocketbooks, for example. There was assumptions about who recovery housing is for overall. Some people felt that that's just not for me. That's for white people because I don't see us in recovery housing. I don't feel welcome going there. And nobody's even interested in wondering why we aren't knocking at the doors at the same rate as white individuals to get into recovery housing. So that's perception slash reality that needs to be addressed. And I think it does represent a gap and an opportunity for change. They want some intentional relationship building with people of color communities. Next slide, please. We've heard it over and over, one size does not fit all, and that is certainly true in the area of recovery issues. The recovery needs to be customized, the respondents said. And one thing that came up, and I was a little surprised about, is a concern about not having access, or many houses not allowing medically assisted treatment in a peer-run or even a manager-monitored facility. So even if you have a prescription for antidepressant, some houses wouldn't let you in there with that drug because it's a drug and we're drug-free. So that's something I think needs to be modified. And they wanted to minimize the complexity of what it takes to get into recovery housing. Some people feel that they're much too invasive and they don't get the kind of help they need when they need it. Next slide, please. They asked for more options for parents and women. One of the concerns with going into recovery housing is, will I lose my children? Is the system going to gobble them up if I go into recovery housing? They would like to see recovery housing with planned accommodations for families to be engaged. The person didn't get addicted in a vacuum, and they're not going to become recovered to the point where they can be productive members of society and good parents in a vacuum. That needs to be infused, and everybody needs to be learning new ways of living and being. So they'd like to make some sort of built-in intentional accommodations for the family, perhaps even having the children be able to live there, little pods or apartments within the recovery housing for families and children. And overall felt that there was a need for more recovery housing at the various levels for women, the perception being that there's mostly men's recovery facilities. Next slide, please. So we asked them to blue sky for us. What do you think are the desired characteristics? What do you want? Don't worry about how it's going to be paid for, who's going to pay for it, but just what do you feel would make for good recovery housing? Next slide. And after being given permission to dream, because it was kind of hard for people, they said, how are we going to pay for it? But they were able to say consistently that they wanted some accountability in these recovery houses. And that's not only for the residents, though they recognize that is important, but for the staff itself in terms of being consistent, being fair, being properly trained, and having levels of empathy and care for the individuals, perhaps providing a good positive role model for what recovery looks like for someone who looks like them. And we recognize that often relapse is a part of recovery, but in some recovery houses, some respondents mentioned that once there was a slip or a relapse, they got kicked out. And that started the vicious downward spiral all over again. So they want to have a measure of grace for a relapse with appropriate consequences, things that are outcomes of slippage, but also with support and not throw them back out into the fire. So they said, one individual, that when you start putting people in a transitional house, you don't want these people coming in here using and messing up what you're trying to have, because you're trying to welcome and cuddle them. They feel that their staff might be trying to welcome them and cuddle them. And you have to have some straight up standards on what you're going to tolerate and what you're not going to tolerate. So I think that's pretty clear. They want some standards. They want some accountability all around. Next slide. What do you want? What's a good recovery house? Well, they said first and foremost, it's clean and it's well kept. And one individual even said, I want it to be clean and I want it to be clean, meaning that, yes, we want it free of dirt and debris and rodents and so on. But in addition to that, we want it to be clean in terms of being free of substances being used in the house, sold in the house. Some people mentioned all kinds of atrocities occurring within some recovery houses and felt that that was almost worse, as bad as being alone. That an addict alone is in bad company, but some of the houses, some of the conditions didn't make people feel real confident that this was a safe environment to make progress in recovery. They want the right level of support and care in screening for who has access and who gets admitted to the recovery house, particularly as concerns co-occurring conditions, mental health issues, for example. Not all mental health or other issues are conducive for introducing that individual into the general population. Sometimes it just doesn't fit and it's not good for that individual and can often be not good for the other folks who would be considered more of the general population. And finally, they said they want people who are ready for or serious about recovering. When I heard that, I understand that that's a very subjective terminology. However, it does speak highly to residents having a voice in what the rules and the structure and the guidelines will be in the recovery house. They have some buy-in, some ownership for it. And they mentioned safety. Safety in terms of building security. Oftentimes, a recovery house or meeting place is a place where drug dealers, entrepreneurs, I call them, will go there because they know they've got an almost fixed population. We've got vulnerable people who it won't take much to make a sale, captive audience. And they want it to be emotionally safe. In recovery, you're encouraged to share your feelings, explore your feelings so that you can react as opposed to respond. But they don't want to be sharing feelings and feeling vulnerable where they might be abused or bullied or looked down on as being weak. So free from abuse in terms of substance use, free from abuse in terms of being disrespected because of differences overall they may have, and free from abuse from just bullying that occurs just like it does in school and out in the community. In particular, one element of diversity was mentioned of age and people being put in elderly people, senior people, in the same environment with these young hotheads, it was called, and it just doesn't work. There's not that level of respect or consideration for an older person, and more attention should be paid for how we mix or place people in these houses.
Dr. Williams, your microphone has been turned off.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. How long is it? Never mind. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. Um, anyway, they're wanting to have professionalism amongst the staff, and they want them to be well trained, and they want them to care, to have empathy for the residents, and not just be interested in filling the census, making sure the beds are full, and keeping the money coming in. They want the staff to be knowledgeable about diversity, multiple cultures, and what they may need or deserve to be able to access the benefits of the recovery house fully. And being multilingual, they said, would be a plus, particularly with Spanish-speaking populations. And again, that standard of core care and quality is valued. They may not know what the national standards are, but they do know that they want some consistency, some guidelines, some parameters on what will and will not happen. It was interesting that this was kind of a cross vocational statement that was made by one person with lived experience. He said, you know how Cincinnati Preschool Promise recently created standards for daycares? I think there needs to be standards, or it may be beneficial to have standards for recovery facilities, because I don't think a suburban facility should have better resources than an inner city facility. And I thought that was profound, but also news we can use. Next slide. There was some discussion about cultural needs and connections and supports. Next slide. It was interesting to me that it was kind of difficult to get people to open up and talk about these things. And it was almost as if these things have been happening or have been this way for so long that I don't even know how to put it into words or to expect that it's going to be different. But with some prompting, we were able to get people to express what would help them feel welcome, what would help them feel represented in these recovery houses. They want a place that includes them. There are some symbols, there are visual and behavioral cues that says this is for you as well as the majority population. They wanted to have people who represent success models, role models, people who look like them, racially, ethnically, and otherwise culturally diverse individuals who have managed to get clean and stay clean. They want diversity of the staff in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual expression, spoken language, expertise, as well as reflecting the diversity of the house or the community. And there was a little bit of that NIMBY, not in my backyard perception. So there's stigma that exists, and that is something that's going to have to be addressed carefully, but it is can be a real stumbling block for people. Next slide. Spirituality. People mentioned that a good recovery house would attend to and have some expectations around there being some spiritual connection to recovery. The most common of which is the 12-step programs and as the inclusion of spirituality, but recognizing that not all people view faith or spirituality the same way. So they wanted accommodation of religious diversity, spaces where people could express their religious rituals and traditions without fear of being teased or looked down upon, materials, etc., time, perhaps, for example, the Islam faith, Muslim faith is one that's pretty prevalent in some of the areas we interviewed, and the ability to pray 5 times a day without a lot of noise in the background, etc., is just one example of that. They said it would be helpful to have clergy that's available for support ongoing, and on-site counselors or social workers to help with just the living needs. Next slide. Again, linguistic options, particularly for Spanish speakers. They want translators to be available, and they want materials to be translated, written materials, so that they will be able to access the services and resources. And other options, because not everybody's literate. So for language, English to not be your first language, and then having some literacy issues as well, we need to be sensitive to those things and make it possible for them to participate fully and also grow along with the recovering person. Next slide. Inclusion. This is Pride Month. LGBTQ plus concerns, accomplishments, etc., is really flooding the airways. But wouldn't it be nice, and not only nice, but isn't it appropriate that that would be an ongoing, not a one-time deal, where we state that the United States and we as a community are all inclusive of races, ethnicity, backgrounds, and gender. But service providers in particular are saying that they get a call at least once a week saying, can you name a house or facility where it would be okay for gay people? And now even more, they're getting calls about, can you think of a place where a person who is in the trans community might be okay or be comfortable. So these are real, they're not going away. And as we plan more recovery housing or enhancing what we have, hopefully those will be in there as a priority. Next slide. Holistic support. We're wrapping up now. Next slide. Overall, it's not just the recovering person that needs to be considered. The whole unit, the family unit, and family is how they define it, needs to be considered and involved, or else they could unintentionally sabotage the recovery process. So they need to be encouraging, they need to provide emotional support, and often need to be taught how to provide emotional support or how to get it. And there is social capital in their networks, so we don't want to discourage that, but we want to educate the whole group or that whole subsystem on what it takes to have a successful recovery, making them aware of triggers and what have been some settings that people used in, and discouraging stepping away from the community. One person said, I don't care if you put an addict on the moon. If he wants to use drugs, he's going to do it. Next slide. So overall, these are some of the direct comments or statements that came up, and the number represents the frequency that we found so far. We are still combing through this data. But they said the desired state includes general life skills, people skills, how you talk to people, how do you interact with the bigger community, legal entities, social service entities, applying for benefits and services, picking up on your responsibilities of child support, financial literacy. I finally got a check. How do I use this? Or how do I not be afraid of having the money because I might use it in an ill-advised way? Transportation is a big deal. Transportation to the recovery houses so that they can get there as well as their family and friends, and transportation to other services and resources, such as their meetings and their doctors and their counselors, etc. They want to have parenting and family skills, and again, the more that could be a part of the recovery house, the better. And they know that job training and employment is important, but just not right away, because that creates extra pressure that could put that very vulnerable and delicate person in that early stage of recovery at risk. They're interested in diet and wellness programs, as well as education and literacy. Some people didn't finish their degree. And overall, access to and coordination with physical health care. Next slide.
Dr. Williams,
Yes.
before you move on to the next slide, a question with regard to these areas that individuals identified as being important to them. Were they in any particular order of importance other than the ones that they mentioned the most? And could you talk a little bit more about the conversation around the basics of room and board? You know, the place to stay, you know, a bed and food to eat, and that conversation with folks, how these other things were so much more, maybe not much more important, but just as important as just that basic housing need.
Well, to the first question, I would say the frequency of and the intensity with which they were expressed indicates the order of importance. And so, as I said, those general life skills, that covers a lot of ground. And then as far as lodging or a place to stay, that's important too, because people are divided. There are really two really strong camps. One, I need to get totally away from where I used to use. Another saying in recovery is, to recover, you need to change one thing, and that's everything. All your old playmates, playgrounds, and playthings. And some people try to literally do that, and it doesn't work. Other people feel that I do need to stay a part of my support system, my network, my family, play cousins, etc. But I need to learn how to do that in spite of what they may be doing. Learn different ways and recognize that I have a choice to use and I don't have to do what they're doing. So that's how it came out. And there was diversity even amongst the groups themselves in terms of how intensely or frequently they express these things.
Thank you.
Okay. Next slide. This slide it's a double entendre, forgive me, but it said in recovery that the elevator to recovery is broken. You have to take the steps. And that often refers to the 12 steps. But also, as I said, there's a lot involved in recovery. And it's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. In recovery, we say one day at a time, one step at a time. And also next steps in our research. Next slide. So, in completing this study, we are going to continue identifying and analyzing the themes that occurred, and I mentioned some of them. We'll be drafting a report with conclusions and recommendations by the end of this month, and we are committed and have put ourselves out there on record that we will disseminate the findings, not only to the sponsors, but for the individuals who were so gracious with their time and information, so that they will see that they were heard, they really appreciate being asked, and they'll have some idea of what might be happening next. So that's how we plan to proceed from this point. I want to thank all of those who participated, those who helped us recruit Interact for Health, for your foresight in seeing how important this is. And I would like to turn things over now to Dr. Bryan.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. No man is an island unto himself. Every man is a part of the main, part of the continent. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I am so fortunate to be a part of this process. And that quote is very, very important because it certainly has implications for what we're about to talk about. That's recovery housing, the LGBT plus populations. And what that means, the quote was over 500 years ago by John Donne. And every time someone would die in the community, this bell would ring or the bell would toll because everyone in the community was impacted and affected by the fact that someone died. And I certainly think that that has implications for today because I am, as well as all of us, should be impacted by anybody who dies from overdose deaths, anybody who dies from HIV/AIDS, from comorbid conditions. And so I want to just say that as we move forward in this presentation, to know that what we do, the commitment that we make to this process, we are helping to save lives. Next slide. So, of course, you all have heard a variety of different hats that I wear. I set up the statewide strategic plan for the opioid epidemic here in Georgia, had the opportunity to be an advanced implementation specialist for the Opioid Response Network, went back to school and got my PhD in adult education, and certainly those are laudable achievements, and I'm proud to have been able to do that. But the hat that I wear that is most important to me and certainly has implications for how to view this presentation is my personal recovery journey. As of August the 16th, 2021, we celebrated 29 years in recovery. And I don't take that lightly. The journey has been arduous and sometimes convoluted. But one thing I want to say is that through all of the dangers and the toils that I went through, being homeless, back in 1985, becoming homeless and sleeping in a park underneath a bush on a daily basis, having to carry all of my belongings in a plastic bag. And I tell you, there is nothing more frightening than not having a safe place to lay your head or to call home. Fortunately, people just like you, that's within the sound of my voice, reached down and picked me up. And because of that, my journey has changed. And particularly the 12-step program, and we'll talk a little bit about that, has been the catalyst for who I am today. And so when I talk about recovery, when I talk about housing, when I talk about my journey, it really is from a perspective that lost dreams have been awakened and infinite possibility arise because of recovery, and recovery is achievable and it's possible. Next slide. And one thing that Dr. Williams mentioned, and that was just a phenomenal presentation, is that in terms of recovery, there's no one size that fits all. There are many sort of roads that lead to recovery. And I have sort of embraced, this idea, not just that we all must be in a 12-step program and that we all must achieve abstinence at all costs, while that's certainly, again, a laudable goal and hopefully a goal for everyone. But what I've learned is also the importance of meeting people where they are. Next slide. So when we talk about recovery housing, let's sort of contextualize what we mean when we say recovery housing. So the National Council on Behavioral Health actually gave a pretty good definition in terms of what is meant by recovery housing. So if you look at the first box, recovery housing is a model that creates peer-led. So we've got peer-led. What that means is it's oftentimes supported and facilitated by peers. So those individuals who perhaps may have achieved recovery or achieved some abstinence from substances, that can also be an example for others to follow in terms of recovery. Mutual supportive environments, alcohol and drug-free living communities, as well as communities that promote the wellness in terms of mental health, spiritual health, as well as social well-being. In the next box, it also says that recovery homes provide people a safe space. And certainly Dr. Williams talked about the importance of having a safe place. As I said, there's just no greater and more frightening experience than to not have a place to lay your head, to not have a safe environment for you to be able to call a place home. And also a goal towards support and mutual accountability, and certainly that's another area that Dr. Williams also mentioned as well. And so this last box really, I sort of think conceptualizes what we're talking about when we're saying that recovery housing is part of a larger continuum of care for people with substance use disorder. And so what we're saying is we want to provide a space, we want to provide a place for ongoing recovery. So I actually went through I stopped counting after 8 recovery houses and recovery programs. But what was most important was that after going into a program for 30 days or 60 days, that there be a continuum of care. So not just stopping at 30 days or 60 days and then sending individuals back to their environment, but really having a continuous sort of housing for recovery to help promote and enhance sustainability in terms of recovery. Next. So when we look at the LGBTQ community, the letters sometimes can be confusing. L means lesbian, G gay, B bisexual, the T trans, Q queer, and the plus was added here to just account for additional kinds of identity, and we can go on and on. There are many other kinds of identity. But in terms of what we mean when we say LGBTQ plus, those are the terms. And so when you look at this graph here, it looks at the drug as well as the comparison between sexual minority and sexual majority. And when you look at the different drugs, you can see when we talk about substances overall, you can see the brown bar stands for the sexual minority and the lighter bar stands for the majority. You can see overall and by far, substance use disorder in the LGBT community is very, very pervasive compared to the majority community. And when we look at what substances used most often in both communities, actually it's marijuana. Then we've got this third bar here, prescription pain relievers. But what I want you to pay some attention to is come all the way down here to methamphetamines. And when we look at methamphetamines in the LGBTQ community, especially among gay men, we see there's a disparity between meth use in minority community, sexual minority community versus sexual majority majority community. And we can safely say now that meth, particularly crystal meth, is an epidemic in the gay community. Next. So one of the things that Dr. Williams mentioned is multiculturalism and really being able to look at individuals and be culturally responsive to their needs. So say, for instance, an individual that comes for screening, for example, what does that individual bring to the table? Well, Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term back in 1989, and it's called intersectionality. And it really looks at all the different identities that an individual actually brings to the table. So when we look at race, we look at gender, we look at class, and also some of the other characteristics. And this next slide really will give you a more focused example. Next. So when you look at, for example, a transgender person that comes into your facility needing housing, needing to be in a recovery program, what are the things that we should know about this individual? First, the idea of cultural competency has been, in recovery circles for many, many years. And my idea around cultural competency, because the word really is kind of thrown around sort of loosely, but I don't ever think that we become totally culturally competent. I believe in the concept of cultural humility. What does that mean? It means, as you mentioned, Dr. Williams, that there's an accountability for not only recovering clients, but also staff, also administrators. And when we talk about cultural humility, that means that we engage in a personal commitment to learn more about different cultures, to constantly educate ourselves about different cultures, to critique our own biases. Everyone comes to the table with some kind of biases. True story, in case in point. I've always had a bias against trans persons. And this is through the years. I'm also a same gender loving person myself, so I am a member of the gay community. But even within the gay community, there's this marginalization of trans persons. But it wasn't until I had a trans person as a sponsee in my recovery family. So I got a chance to really interact with this person. I got a chance to talk to this person. And I tell you, my entire thought process and thinking about the trans community was totally transformed. To be able to understand what they go through on a daily basis just to survive really has changed my attitude. And as we move forward next, so we look at the different intersectionality. So there's racial discrimination. Next, there's transphobia. So there's this intense, in many communities, just discrimination in terms of the trans community. Also, stigma against sex work. That's another one that I'd always been very judgmental about. And before I actually knew and began to understand the person that I was sponsoring, I always thought sex workers were, kind of, something that I wasn't really, keen on. And I always had this attitude, well, they should be able to find a job. Why are they doing this work? It wasn't until I understood that many in the trans community can't find a job because of discrimination. Oftentimes, not only, again, are they discriminated within their own community, they're also discriminated against in housing in terms of recovery. And so that was one area that really, really opened my eyes. Next. And so we can there are about 3 or 4 more bubbles so that we can just go ahead and populate. Unstable housing, history of incarceration, that's a big one. Because oftentimes when we talk about sex work, that is a crime in many communities. So many of these individuals have a very lengthy criminal justice record. And in some states, when we're talking about particularly HIV and criminalization, if you are, and I think it's in St. Louis, if you are arrested for prostitution or sex work, I should say, and it is known that you are HIV positive, oftentimes, rather than just having a misdemeanor on your record, you then are elevated to a much higher level of incarceration. And so it is very, very much a part of the culture in terms of criminal justice to really, really discriminate against trans persons. And of course, HIV status and the criminalization of HIV, as well as violence. There's just an epidemic of violence against trans persons. So these are all the intersectionalities. These are what a person brings to the table when they come to the screening process for housing. Next. So we want to talk now about action. What is it that we can do as a community, as professionals working in the field? What are the action steps that we can take? Next. There was one research that I found very, very interesting. And this research was qualitative research that really looked at the feasibility as well as sustainability of having a recovery house specifically for LGBTQ. So this study actually was done in a small LGBT recovery home, and they did focus groups as well as key informant interviews as well. So in the focus groups, there were 3 areas that were salient. And some of the statements I thought were very, very interesting. So the title of the study, Addressing the Needs of Gay and Bisexual Men in LGBT-Specific Recovery Housing. So these are recovering houses specifically for LGBTQ. And so 3 areas really stood out: referral source, expectations, and experiences. So this is what the clients say that these were the actual quotes. So in terms of referral, one client said, my counselor referred me. And he just came along and said, oh, by the way, there's a gay and bisexual house in Austin, Texas. So word of mouth is a way that these particular and specific houses can be identified for specifically LGBT community. The other one that was fairly salient was expectation. And this quote says, I actually told the coordinator in the office that I needed to be in a straight house because I was afraid I would end up making an unhealthy attachment to someone else in the house. And this particular house was among men, so the other issue here is that if there is a sexual attraction among the men that are in the house, it may create problems. And so that was one concern. And the last one, experience. And this particular quote notes that it's just a bunch of level-headed guys who are really serious about the program and want to get well. So overall, this program was really, really positive in the eyes of this client population. Next. So when we look at key informant findings, so these were actually the providers that lent their expertise in terms of this particular studies. So the key informant spoke directly to the needs of the home as well as LGBT specific residents. So one of the things that they really spoke pretty clearly about is the need to address co-occurring conditions such as depression, anxiety, bipolar, HIV, and AIDS. And that's important because particularly in the aging population, these are these other co-occurring conditions that may not be, well, they aren't necessarily treated at the home, but being able to refer these clients to places that are also affirming, very, very important. And so there have been situations in some recovery houses where referrals have been made, particularly for LGBT, that were to places that were not affirming at all, that were discriminating, in fact. And so part of that cultural humility process for providers is to make sure that they are educated in terms of who they're referring their clients to. So for example, in the trans community, you may want to begin to call the place that you're referring the individual to first to educate them on, for example, nouns and pronouns that the individual may be using. It may be in contrast to really what's on their birth certificate. So that kind of information really helps form a warmer handoff in terms of referral process. Also, again, as Dr. Williams mentioned, the key informants talked about the importance of a home being a place that was drug and alcohol free. And lastly, a home that felt comfortable and in a neighborhood with community resources. And Dr. Williams also mentioned just this whole idea of not in my neighborhood. And we all know too well that many communities really rise up when there is a recovery home in their neighborhoods. But one of the things that's important, particularly in this study's findings, is to establish relationships with the community at hand to let them know what's happening. Also establishing relationships in many communities and outside communities with LGBT organizations so they can provide information, they can provide support as well for these individuals. Next. So when we talk about language, the other thing, and here's the other area where we're talking about cultural humility and really educating oneself, one of the things that we can do is begin to change our language. And thank you, Dr. Williams, for just highlighting the fact that how important it is to change our language. And I also get mixed up, in terms of language, and sometimes I'll one of the things that I find myself doing is referring to audience as you guys. And I try to catch myself with that, but I've been doing it for so long. But the process of changing our language from stigmatized language to preferred language. So I'm just going to go over just a couple examples. So for example, instead of using the stigmatized language abuser, we use something that's more preferred such as a person with or suffering from substance use disorder. In terms of a stigmatized language around addict, the word addict, we changed that to a person with a substance use disorder. Another example, when we talk about, let's say, the term lapse or relapse as a stigmatized term, we changed that to resume or experience a recurrence. And lastly, this last bullet point here, or the last highlight here, the term substance abuse, we try to move away from that stigmatized language to someone with a substance use disorder. And so I'm sure that I hope this presentation will be available so that you can really look at this list. And this list was really put out by the ATTC, Addiction Technology Transfer Center, and you can go online and pull it up. But it's really, really good. Even when I'm writing, when I'm doing any kind of presentation, I have a hard copy so that I'm making sure that the language that I'm using is language that's affirming and language that's appropriate. Next slide. And also language in terms of the LGBT community. Again, I talked about what the LGBTQ letters mean, but we also, within the LGBT community, want to change from stigmatized language to affirming language. So, for example, the term homosexual, we try to stay away from that term to the term gay people, person-centered kind of language. The idea of sexual preference, because for many, it's not necessarily preference, it's just how they were born. And so we use the term sexual orientation instead. Again, BMSM, Black men who have sex with men, we try to move away from that term, which was a term that was sort of put on Black gay men for scientific reasons, but it's so limiting because Black men are more than just sex. And so what we want to do is help to better conceptualize them from a more loving and a more caring perspective. So we use the term same gender loving, which encompasses just a myriad of characteristics that exemplifies that community. And lastly, this last term, junkie, meth head, tweaker, we really want to change from that stigmatized language to persons who use substances. Next. And so just some takeaways that are important in terms of really operationalize what myself and Dr. Williams, as well as the Interact for Health have said. Ongoing self-education, very important, cultural humility. This next point, specific sexual minority options for housing, as well as peer support, also important. Another idea around gender-neutral bathrooms in recovery homes are important as well. Comprehensively address co-occurring mental and physical conditions, having affirming environment, as well as incorporating family support. And that idea is important because when we look at the LGBT community, oftentimes the family support is not necessarily the biological family or the traditional family. When we try and engage those individuals that are in that person's circle that is considered their family. And so that could be a partner. They are to be recognized. They could be married. That partner should be recognized and acknowledged, as well as close friends who could provide and promote support for that individual. Next slide. So I want to end, this is next to the last slide, but I thought this was important saying. And Maya Angelou said that I think it annoys God if you walk past the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. And what that really reflects is the importance of everyone, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your race, religion. We are all more alike than we are different. And so, as we look at recovery housing, as we look at being as supportive as we possibly can in terms of a person's recovery journey, we want to look at everyone as important, everyone as really, really worthy of becoming substance free. And so the work that you all are doing is magnificent work. It's work that's very, very important. And certainly, as I can attest to, a work that you may not see the fruits of your labor right away, but ultimately down the line, the things that you do may have a positive impact on a person's life in terms of their recovery journey. Next slide. And so this is my contact information. I'm open to further conversations, further presentations. I, again, work for the part-time for the Opioid Response Network. We do provide technical assistance as well as training in this area as well as other areas simply by dialing or by going to the website opioidresponsenetwork.org. And I think that may be on the last slide next. Yeah, I think that's the last slide, but opioidresponsenetwork.org, and look at some of the training and technical assistance that we provide for organizations to help you increase your capacity and help you be a more affirming organization in terms of not only LGBTQ, but for BIPOC communities overall. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Both of your presentations were wonderful and insightful. I'm going to turn it over to Sonia, and she's going to lead our Q&A. And please, everyone, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will be sure to answer them.
I want to take a moment to personally thank both of you for the partnership, Dr. Williams, that we had with the focus groups. Your energy and your insightfulness, Dr. Bryant, that you always bring to these discussions. I've listened to you more than once now in a webinar. A great motivator to take something and walk away with it and have a positive impact. With regard to the findings from the focus groups and with regard to working with the LGBTQ community, if I was a recovery housing operator, what would you, either one of you, recommend my first step be if I want to make sure that I'm operating a home that's welcoming to anybody who's seeking recovery? And I would say, is that even possible? Is it just that if I have a home for men with 10 beds and 9 of the beds are filled by white men, is that an environment that could even potentially be welcoming?
Say, real briefly, make sure that if you have a governing body, a board of directors, you have a stake owner or 2 or 3 representative of the group so that you can have their voice present. Don't assume that you know it from the books or what you heard in another research study and create something that doesn't fit. Go to the source and include them in a meaningful way with advising you on how to structure and run this house.
Fantastic, Dr. Williams. And also, I would say most programs have a website, and your website should reflect your mission. Even if you have to change your mission statement to something that's affirming, that says all are welcome, regardless of your cultural background, regardless of your sexual orientation, being very explicit, that really does go a long way. Because oftentimes when people are looking for recovery housing or looking for a program to go to, the first place they go to is your webpage. So if your webpage only reflects images that are all white, then that may be something you may want to consider changing. And also, again, like you mentioned, Dr. Williams, having a board that's reflective of the population that you are serving, very, very important, as well as having staff that is reflective of the population. And what's also important, particularly at the intake process, is so important because that is that person with that intersectionality that's coming to you for help, that's crying for help. And the number one thing that just in all the studies that I have done, the one thing that they want you to do is to listen, to be attentive, to be affirming. Processes like looking at what your strategies are in terms of theoretical perspectives. The minority stress model is a great model to engage LGBT and BIPOC persons in recovery because it takes into consideration those intersectionalities. Other coping mechanism strategies can be used, and also motivational interviewing is another way that we can really, really engage the person, engage the participant in the recovery process and identifying their strengths, because nobody comes to the table for help and not have anything at all. And so when we're talking about meeting them where they are, oftentimes look at their strengths, look at those things. For example, they may have a very strong faith. And so really incorporating that into their recovery process and acknowledging that you know that that's important to them. And so those are just some of the things I think that we can do as leaders, as program providers, to at least open the door and acknowledge you may not be the best, but you are concerned and you care about this particular person. And I want to close with this. People will say in their experiences, I don't necessarily, remember all of the things that you did. I don't remember how good the program was, but what I do remember is how you treated me. How you treated me. And through the 8 rehabs that I've been through, and that was almost 30 years ago, I remember how I was treated at each and every one of them. And the last thing, people will say, and we talked about word of mouth and how important that is, people will say about experience, if they have a bad experience, if they have a good experience, they will tell 5 people. But if they have a bad experience, they will tell 25 people. So it's very, very important how we treat individuals.
Great, thank you both. We do have a comment, or not a comment, a question in the chat. It's a great question from Dylan McCormick. The 12-step program has belief in a higher power as a key component, which many people understand as a religion. Many people in the LGBTQ community have traumatic experiences with the church. So how does one navigate around that issue when working with LGBTQ people in recovery?
Great, great, great question. First of all, the 12-step program is not a religious program. They are very, very clear that we are not a religious program, we are a spiritual program. And also, in my early recovery, in my first year, I went to a LGBT affirming 12-step group within the fellowship. Now, while I experienced some negative effects in terms of racism, because you would think that we are all LGBT, we're all wanting recovery or in recovery, when I first came to the group, it was 90% white. And within 6 months, the whites had taken flights because they did not want to be around blacks. And so ultimately, within that 6 months, the group was 90% black. And so while there are some issues in terms of the 12-step program, I really feel like we've evolved and become much, much more affirming. But certainly we're very, very careful not to intersect religion into that process.
I would just add, in agreement with what Dr. Bryan said, that we stress that the power greater than yourself as you understand it, as you define it. We talk about people reparenting themselves. People have all kinds of trauma related to religion and so on. So you get to choose. Some people it's the universe. Some people it's a beautiful mountain range. But whatever works for you as powerful and positive force in your life, that's your higher power.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. As we wait for other people to post questions in the chat, I'd like to go back to the first question that I asked with regard to how do owners operators make a home inviting and welcoming to everyone. And you gave some great practical guidance on how to do that as owners, operators, and staff. How would you suggest that we go about doing that with existing residents? How do we create that peer environment that is open and welcoming to all?
I think just from my experience, conducting community groups is very, very important, and knowing how to conduct them in a way that's supportive and in a way that's affirming. And we all know that when you get to know people that are different from you, ultimately discrimination and bias decreases. And so what happened in many of these groups, just the idea of sharing in these groups, interacting with people that are different, really sort of solidify this idea that we really see we're more alike than we are different. We are alike because we're in this space and we all want to become free of substances. We all want a better life. We all want to use our talents that was given to us at birth that drugs robbed us of. And when those kinds of messages, and that's why the skills and the abilities of the counselors are so important to be able to engage in that kind of environment. And that wasn't always the case. There were some very toxic experiences that I've had in recovery housing, and particularly among counselors who basically did not have the educational skills to provide evidence-based services. So they sort of went off either their own recovery experiences or just pulled things from out of the sky. And a lot of it was very, very toxic.
So I'm still monitoring the chat, and I think that all of our community partners that participate in our monthly webinar series know that if you don't ask a question, I will. And we are getting ready to come up on time here, and we've got about 5 minutes. And I want to go back to when we were going over the slides, and Dr. Williams alluded to the importance of language and language matters, because we had a conversation around clean and clean. And our efforts here at Interact for Health to be very person-centered in the language that we use, and always making sure that we are being good role models on using the proper words and proper language. How important is it, and we talked about this, but I'd like for you two to share, that if I'm somebody that owns or operates, or I'm working in a recovery house as a peer mentor or whatever, that even though I may hear somebody in recovery refer to themselves as an addict, that I don't refer to that person as an addict. And we talked about that self-affirming language, and just because you use it doesn't mean that I should refer to you that way. So if you wouldn't mind, we had a really powerful conversation around that, and I know we've got 4 minutes, but I would love for you to share the importance of making sure that if you are a leader or have some type of role in a recovery house, how important it is that we monitor our own life.
I think you hit it on the head. Find out what they prefer, what makes them comfortable, and use that. Now, there are some, even if I'm giving permission to use certain terms, I choose not to use it because I know how loaded it can be, and I want to avoid the perception of impropriety. So somebody else could come along and hear that and just be totally stumbled and thrown off with that. So, but learn what the person prefers and then negotiate it that way. They say, oh, I would prefer to be called an addict. You say, okay, well, I'm really not comfortable with that. So if it's okay with you, can I just call you Jeff or whatever and go with it that way?
I concur.
That was too easy for you, Doctor.
But the hard part is remembering because we go on autopilot. And again, from my own personal lived experiences, there were things that were okay for me that now, some number of decades later, is not PC. What's wrong with you? You know, so I have to stay on guard and stay humble. As Dr. Bryan said, I wanted to remember that. I use the term arrogant humility in terms of doing research with people. I know some book knowledge, I know some methodologies and so on, but then the humility comes in, you are the expert on you. I need you to teach me. I am open for learning. Teach me. You are the best person to represent you. So that humility goes a long way, regardless of the topic.
And thank you both very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to close this out for today.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. And a huge, huge thank you to Dr. Bryant and Dr. Williams. Really, really great, relevant, actionable information. We're so happy to have you guys join us. One last plug, if you've been following along in the chat, please fill out our survey so we can hear from you all, hear how we did, what else you'd like to learn about. So thank you all so much for joining us, and you will receive a follow-up email with a recording and link to the survey as well.
Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.